I'm Helen Armitage.
And I'm Chris Webb.
And you're listening to The Next Normal, the podcast that explores the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had and continues to have on different individuals, organisations and sectors spanning the world of business, education and careers.
On The New Normal, we heard from a range of individuals about how they were adapting to a challenging climate. And we're now taking this one step further as we look to the future and quiz another slate of fantastic guests about how they're planning for the unknown, what different sectors are doing to adapt, and whether any green shoots of optimism are starting to appear in the wake of the pandemic and subsequent lockdown.
Thank you for joining us as we explore what the next normal might look like for all of us on a local, national and global scale.
A very good morning and welcome to The Next Normal. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Helen Armitage. Helen, how are you doing today on the 1st of December, 2020?
I'm good, thank you. 1st of December, first window in the Advent calendars, it's sunny. I would say 8 out of 10. 8 out of 10. Yeah. How about you, Chris?
It's got to be. It's the start of the month of December. I can start wearing Christmas shirts and jumpers, as you can see already. For me, it's probably going even higher, going up to a 9. So very excited. About the only thing I have been excited about this year. So it's a good start. And we're very pleased today to kind of turn our attention to another aspect of work that's perhaps been kind of much maligned and the victim of misrepresentation during the pandemic, and that is data. And so in our last series, we spoke about the use of labour market information with Charlie Ball and Helen Janota. In this series, we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the use of data, so particularly focusing on the AG careers sector, but also addressing some broader themes as well. So we're delighted to be joined by two individuals with significant experience in this field. So first of all, we're joined by Naomi Oosman-Watts, Head of Strategic Projects, Student Services at Newcastle University and Director for Data Insights at AGCAS. So Naomi, very good morning to you.
Morning. Thanks for having me on the podcast. It's really great to be here.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us. And we're also joined by Richard Hewitt, who is the Director of Higher Education at Emsi UK. So Richard, again, very good to have you with us. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thanks. Great to be here.
Brilliant. So we're going to get stuck into the topic very shortly, but before we do, as always, we're going to start with our gloom busters, our good news stories for the week. So Helen, do you want to kick us off with perhaps the week where we kind of have an inkling about what these good news stories are going to be about?
Yeah, just a quick one from me. So it's my birthday on Friday. So I'll not be celebrating it in the way that I thought I was going to be celebrating it. But nonetheless, it's a birthday, so I'll be celebrating in some kind of style. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, some kind of style. Very diplomatic. Yeah, within the lockdown restrictions, of course. Within the
absolutely. Yeah.
Have to kind of put that disclaimer. Naomi, I believe you've got a kind of Christmassy themed good news story for us as well this week too.
Well, I'm especially excited about Christmas, and also today is obviously the 1st of December, so we get to open up all our Advent calendars. I've got 3 this year just to make up for the fact that the rest of the year has been particularly rubbish. So I'm going with Bailey's, chocolate, and some makeup. So I feel like this evening is going to be a good one.
That's brilliant. I think this has been the one year where I've not begrudged anybody starting to put trees up, decorations earlier than December. I think this is the year where people probably do need it. So, and Richard, to kind of continue that theme, we've got a good news story about data.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure it's quite on that theme, but I saw in the papers that the supercomputer DeepMind has been using artificial intelligence, a program called AlphaFold, which anyway, what it's able to do is predict how proteins fold into 3D shapes. It all sounds very exciting and incredibly complicated, but what it seems to have done is jump forward a lot of research that would otherwise have taken years and years and years to do very significantly. And that it's exciting to see how things like data and AI really can make a difference when applied to a particular problem. And you're just using that massive capability to calculate and really leveraging that and applying that to problems that can really make a difference in terms of developing treatments, medicines. I think that's quite nice.
Yeah, absolutely. National Careers Week actually had a booklet, The Future of Work, that came out yesterday, aimed at sort of schools and colleges, which is all about sort of fourth industrial revolution. And I think those sort of examples you've mentioned are great ones for kind of education staff in schools and colleges to then use when having those conversations with young people, really sort of bringing it to life. So great to hear about that too. Fantastic. So good news story for the week. We're in a positive frame of mind. Helen, over to you.
Right, okay. If we just get started then, just with yourself, Naomi, I'll come to you first. Tell us a bit about how COVID-19 has impacted your work and life so far this year.
I mean, for me, it's been a huge change because I've moved from actually being within the career service to working across student services on a range of actually COVID-related strategic projects. It's kind of given me sight of very much the holistic student experience, so how and where the career service sits within that wider student experience, and how that sort of data and that student view tracks across the different elements of their experience, and the difference between the sort of internal plumbing of the university in terms of where those sit and what the student experience is on the other end and how we can improve that. So yeah, I've been working on everything from supporting students in self-isolation to most recently getting the test centre for rapid testing set up at our university. So it's been a very, very different experience for me. And really interesting though to have that with the sort of careers context head on as well. So it's given me a sort of different perspective on the university experience.
Incredibly busy as well, yeah. And Richard, how about yourself? How has it impacted your life and work this year?
Well, let's just say I was very happy when my wife's work qualified her as a key worker, and I was therefore able to put my kids back in school, because I think working from home is great, but working from home with 3 young children is not, particularly when you're expected to school them, as so many people have been in that boat, and hats off to them. Multitasking is not my forte, and I was starting to, I had about 2 weeks of it, and was realizing I wasn't going to get through. But when things changed for my wife, and I was able to make use of the ability to put kids in school, then things became far easier for me personally. But we've had a really, really busy year. There's been such a demand for people to understand what's going on, trying to get as much evidence as they can as to what might happen, but at least what is happening. And be it local government or local enterprise partnerships in England, or careers teams who've got whole cohorts of students graduating into a labour market that's suddenly on furlough. How on earth do you deal with that? And just everyone realising no one's necessarily got all the answers, but everyone needs as much information as they can to try and do the best that they can with all of that. And so it's just been incredibly busy, which is great, but also it's not for the best of reasons. But it's been really interesting to see what people then do with that information, and certainly that's not been the same across the board. So yeah, busy, but I think a lot of positive things coming from it.
Excellent, thanks, Richard. That's really good to hear. And you've obviously talked a lot about kind of how much busier work's got in terms of the work that Emsi are doing. And I suppose we've seen a lot of commentary around the way data's been used and presented throughout the course of this pandemic, and obviously some better and some sort of worse examples. Key ones I know sort of being things like the algorithm, in inverted commas, in the summer, and also some of the feedback, I guess, coming from the lockdown 2.0 PowerPoint and how that data was presented to the public. One of the big things we like to do on the podcast is obviously address kind of common misconceptions. And I think we've spoken about this before, that there are these common misconceptions about how data is used, and how maybe individuals and organizations kind of perceive data and what it's used for. So I suppose really the first question we want to come to, and this is for both of you, but we'll start with Richard if that's okay, is do you think there are these kind of common misconceptions around data use? And what can individuals and organizations do to address this, bearing in mind some of the problems that we've kind of outlined?
Yeah, of course you're right, and I think data, from having been something that automatically made things seemed robust at the beginning of all of this. Oh no, this is what the data says. We're following the data and all of that, and suddenly, well, not suddenly, depends on your perspective, I suppose, but over the course of this experience, what we've seen is people increasingly become interested to say, well, hang on a moment, is that what I think it is? Is it suggesting what they're saying it's suggesting, or could it be something else? And I think the realization is actually it's very akin to the way people have always thought about statistics, in that you can make statistics be whatever you want, and of course data and statistics are incredibly closely intertwined as fields, and so there's a negativity there in that there is less of an automatic trust of data, but I think that's a good thing, because in the end you do need to know, hang on, what is this data that we're looking at? Are we comparing apples with apples, or are we comparing apples with oranges? You know, in crisis, we've been looking at comparing death rates between different countries and infection rates, where you have different testing regimes and different methods of recording and all of those sorts of things. And people realize, oh, actually, no, these aren't the same thing. So some of these big headlines we're seeing are maybe not quite as reliable as they might be. And I think that is causing people to increasingly, when they see the word data, well, hang on, what data is it? How is it reliable? What can I compare that with? How can I use it? And I think that that's a really good thing. And for those of us who provide data, it's really important that we are very open and honest about what that data is, how we've got it, how we've processed it, and not to be a black box. And in the commercial sector, for some organizations, that's really difficult because a lot of it's proprietary. But I think if you're not doing that, it is really tricky for people to be able to use your data with confidence. And I think that's really important. It's something we've seen right through this time.
I've seen you sort of nodding along there, Naomi, whilst Richard was kind of talking. I know, obviously, within your kind of AGCAS role in terms of data insights, you've worked with a lot of different stakeholders regarding kind of various data sets. Do you have anything just to add on that front in terms of those kind of maybe common misconceptions you come up against when you're having those conversations with people?
I think in higher education, where we see the most misconceptions is probably around, things like league tables and what those mean, and the pressure for teams internally to sort of work to metrics. And that's been sort of increasingly prominent, I think, in our sector for the last few years, and has become a subject of conversation at every level of the institution, but also in the context of things like open days and the value of higher education. And so there's a lot of misconceptions around what that data represents. And I really do agree when Richard says we have to be open and honest about what does that represent, what does it mean, and contextualize that. It's really challenging in a sort of world where quick and easy messages are what people want to hear. So they want to say, where are you ranked for employability? But that needs a lot of context in terms of what is that metric? How is it put together? What does that mean? How does that reflect the student population? All of those sorts of things that you can't feasibly put in a league table, that are conversations that we need to be having at all different levels of the organization to raise awareness of the utility of that information and what data's gone into creating those sort of metrics and those league tables. So I do think there's a lot of conversation still to be had in that space, and there's also a lot more sort of clarity and transparency that we need to achieve when we look at higher education related metrics and data as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Naomi. I know Helen's going to come on to talk about some of the kind of confidence issues and stuff specifically linked to kind of HE careers, but just to kind of follow on very quickly while we're kind of on the topic, maybe around, as you said, context and perhaps the simplicity of the message. I suppose with data, for me, sometimes we kind of get this same argument as you get with financial literacy that people like Martin Lewis have made, that it's something that just feels alien to people. You know, they don't understand it, so we'll go with the simplest analogy. And I suppose we've had it this week in the press with Laura Kuenssberg and the idea of kind of maxing out, the nation's credit cards and using like analogies that don't actually work in fact, or aren't based in fact, but they're perhaps easy to sort of sell or easy to pitch in the media. Do you think there are potentially sort of issues around that as well in terms of the way that data is kind of presented as a broad topic?
I think there is sometimes, and I do think that we really, in particular in the sort of sector that we're in, it's very easy to reach for the headlines and to look at, we've seen a lot of talk in the sector at the moment about, the new Start for Success metric and this idea of value for many degrees and Mickey Mouse degrees and all this conversation around, what is the value of a degree course, and very much relying on metrics and data to justify some of that rhetoric. And it's not as simple as that. We all know it. Those of us who work in higher education, we know that you can't necessarily just measure that in numbers and figures and salary outcomes. And so I think simplifying that sort of message in terms of saying, okay, we've got these numbers, and so based on those, we can make a value judgment on someone's experience, is that sort of rhetoric of kind of coming back to what is the simplest explanation we can give and how can we boil this down to something that people will engage with and understand, rather than thinking about actually this is a really complex issue that involves all sorts of things, from grades on entry to experience that students have to extracurricular experience to ambition to personal and individual stories that are involved in that. And it's not quite as easy as we might be led to think, to just boil it down to this is the degree and this is the outcome.
Okay, so this is part of the podcast, our Top of the Pods part of the podcast, where we ask our guests their favourite podcasts that they're listening to at the moment. So Richard, I'll come to you first. Give us your favourites.
There's one that I like in particular from the US called Let's Talk About Skills, Baby, which is a very American name, but it's a serious podcast looking at how the people are interviewed and how they have acquired the skills that have made them successful, how they've developed them, the innovative approaches that they may be seeing in improving skills-based hiring, and learning as skills-based learning as well. So it's really interesting. A colleague of mine, in fact, runs it, Kelly Bailey. Nothing to do with the company; it's her own podcast. But it's I always find it interesting to hear what's happening across the pond, because so often it does come over, and it's an interesting different perspective to get. I suppose another. I don't know if it counts as a podcast, but there is a radio show which you can watch listen to on Catch Up, which is kind of like a podcast, isn't it? But Preparing for Brexit with Digby Jones on Times Radio. I think that's really interesting, just hearing about real businesses, what they're doing to prepare, not getting on a soapbox and talking about the politics of it all, but the actual practicalities and what's actually happening. And the challenges, but how they're facing up to the challenges. I find that really very interesting indeed.
Yeah, I've checked out that podcast before in the past as well, Richard. Really interesting, just from a business kind of logistical point of view, the huge impact that it's going to have, both positive and negative. Definitely worth checking out. Absolutely. Naomi, we'll come to you next. Give us your favourites.
Well, I think I've got three. So one of them is, if you work in the higher education sector, the One Key podcast is an absolute godsend, really, for keeping on top of everything that's going on, in particular in recent times, policy changes, that sort of thing. If you're interested in higher education policy and data, then I would highly, highly recommend dipping into that when you've got the time. I personally have been listening to more recently a Harvard Business Review podcast called Women at Work, which is basically careers advice from various different women at different stages in their career, talking about their journeys, their experience, things like mentorship, sponsorship, that sort of thing, which is really, really fascinating and interesting, and lots of practical tips for sort of managing your career. There's a Race at Work one as well that they've just started. I haven't listened to yet, but is on my list of things to kind of follow up. And my last one is a little bit off topic, but it's a CrossFit related podcast called Chasing Excellence by Ben Bergeron, who's a CrossFit trainer. It's a little bit American. So both of those, the Harvard Business Review and Chasing Excellence, are both US. It's a little bit American. So the British people amongst you, dial down your sort of resilience to cheesiness. But it's got some good advice on, again, sort of being resilient, overcoming obstacles, and sticking with things. So I found that one quite interesting. But if you're not into CrossFit, it might not be to your taste.
I would absolutely second the Women at Work one. I've listened to that a few times and absolutely brilliant. You're right, very American, but if you can get past that, or if you enjoy that, that's fine. It's a brilliant podcast, so highly recommended. So thank you both. That's brilliant. Yeah. So what do we think are the top tips or things to consider for predominantly HE careers professionals when utilising certain data sets? What would your recommendations be as to what they should be considering if it's not as black and white as what's being presented to them? What would be the things that you would consider that they should be considering? Sorry.
Yeah. The first thing is say, and it's a bit of an answer to the previous question as well, in that just because there are questions you can ask around the data means it doesn't mean you shouldn't be asking any questions of the data. As with stats, and the same with data, you can always challenge and you can always say this isn't perfect, but you shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of good or even a little bit insightful. So that, you know, it may not be a full representation of what's happening, but it will give you some insights, and those are insights that perhaps you've never had before. And if you think what you did have before, which may have been anecdote or some old school data from the deli and things like that, then perhaps having a few new insights may actually be quite useful. And it's not saying that this is the new God-given solution and answer to everything we're looking for, but it's adding another piece to the puzzle and just understanding that. And I do see sometimes in the sector that people are very quick to knock things down, but not necessarily put anything in their place, or what stays in the place is what's always been done, and you have that inertia, and it's not there because it's better, it's there because, well, it's already there. And so I think we have to be very careful about, yes, we can knock things down, and that's fine, we need to understand what they are, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that we can do that with everything, and we can still gain insight by exploring what we can learn. In terms of specific data, example I commonly use when working with universities is if you're looking at things like job numbers, you know, there are different data sets you can use to look at job numbers. And one of those is the data that comes through from the Office for National Statistics, which is official data based on big surveys of the labour market. Other data you can get, and we supply both, but other data you can get is on from job postings. So you go to a jobs board and you look at the number of jobs being advertised in a particular area. Those two sources are both interesting and provide interesting insights, but they are different things. An online job posting is not necessarily a job. A big increase in the number of online job postings does not necessarily mean the total number of jobs in an area is higher than it was previously. It could be, for example, I don't know, you have a supermarket closing down in one town and opening in a neighboring town. The total number of jobs is the same, but they're not bringing the staff with them, they're hiring new staff. It's a simple example, but that can happen in all parts of the labour market. Now, it's not, is it useless information that a new supermarket's opening and hiring a new group of staff, even though the total job numbers are the same? No, that's useful information in itself, but it's understanding that different data sets provide you with different insights and can be used for different purposes. And what we do see sometimes is people using one set of data to provide trends that or insights that really you would want to be using a different data set for. And so I think that kind of thing you need to be a bit careful of.
Really interesting. I'm just wondering then, how can we instill or build confidence with colleagues who work in the HE sector, mainly careers professionals or academics as well, or other parts of student services? Are there any examples that you've been able to implement, Naomi and Richard, that you've used to build that confidence with colleagues? Naomi, I'll come to you first with this one.
So actually, when I joined the career service at Newcastle, we did a big piece of work around working with the service and the team to move our sort of practice from being not as data focused to being a lot more data informed. So not necessarily what I would say data led. So we weren't necessarily just looking at the figures and reacting to them. It was very much using that as a piece of information to sort of contextualize conversations that colleagues were having in academic schools and to support the development and delivery of the services that we offer to students in a much more targeted way so that we could generate the impact that we needed with different groups of students. That's a really challenging journey to go on when colleagues haven't necessarily been in a position where they've needed to work very closely with data. So a few of the things that we did was, at the time we had a lot of internally sort of created systems. We've moved now to an off-the-shelf, but we built a series of dashboards linked in through to our systems to allow that kind of easier visibility and manipulation of the data so that it didn't involve lots of spreadsheets and scary pivot tables and things like that. So that was a very basic first step that I would say, everybody should be thinking about. If you don't have dashboarding capacity already, think about talking to your system provider, or think about how you might generate some resource internally to get that sort of set up. But really think about, what do you need to know? One of the things that we spent a lot of time doing when we first started was very much scoping those dashboards and thinking about, what might we want to know? Like, oh, this would be quite interesting. And what do we actually need to know to inform the conversation? Because if you go down this might be interesting, you'd be there forever, which was a challenging conversation to have, because every time we started talking about things, it was like, oh, but maybe we could also know. What do we need to know? And so that was the first step, very much kind of having that visual representation of the data, making it easy to engage with, easy to use. And then we did quite a bit of training and internal discussions. So colleagues from the planning team supported us with some of the training in terms of what they were doing in their space. They're the experts, they're the analysts. So how do they interpret the data? How do they discuss data? How do they have conversations with academic colleagues in that space? That was really helpful. So we did a lot of working across careers and planning. And we also did a little bit of work with our academic colleagues, so jointly with our sort of academic leads for employability and enterprise, bringing everyone together and really examining and exploring the data and thinking about contextualizing what that meant. So the Delhi data that we used at the time, I have a lasting affection for Delhi, and I worked on it for a number of years. And Delhi gave us a really good picture, actually, of what our student population looked like at quite a granular level. So at subject level, we could still see that population and have a look at their journeys and where they were going, and having those conversations with academics around what's happening in this space, what do we need to do, how do we react to some of this, and really contextualizing that data and explaining the different sort of downsides to it as well. So what are we not looking for here? What is this not telling us? And very much having those conversations in kind of a safe space where we were all there and we could all support each other to then preempt those individual conversations at school level, where careers advisors could go into their own sort of assigned schools and have those conversations on a more individual basis based on an action plan that was pulled together from the dashboard. So here are the different data sets, and here is an action plan that we've all worked on together that we're going to come together and discuss. So a very supported process that allowed people to understand how to have those conversations and feel confident that they could analyze and interpret the data for themselves.
Absolutely brilliant. Thanks, Naomi. Really, really kind of comprehensive answer there. I'm going to bring in Richard in a second. Possibly before we get into a conversation about data from the Delhi, we should point out to any listeners at home, this isn't some sort of strange dish that we're talking about here. This is the Destination for Leavers of Higher Education survey. For those who aren't familiar, we will put some information in the episode notes. But interesting, because again, comes back, Richard, to what you've sort of said about different kind of data being interpreted differently, being used differently by different services in particular ways. So I think it's kind of touched on everything that's been mentioned. We've talked there obviously about kind of confidence and sort of building confidence, but leading in, I suppose, to the kind of the final sort of meat of the topic we want to focus on today. And Richard, again, this might kind of lead back to some other stuff you were going to mention in relation to the last question. Always on the Next Normal, we're looking to kind of maybe look ahead and perhaps kind of scope out some predictions from our guests about what might be changing over the coming kind of months and years. And obviously this year we've seen the introduction of the Graduate Outcomes Survey, the replacement for Delhi. And we've seen, as has been mentioned during this podcast, much more of a focus on kind of data and what it can do. So Richard, from your perspective, what do you kind of feel perhaps that next normal might be for the use of data within HE from what you've seen? And are there any kind of key messages that you'd want sort of people listening to take away on that front?
Well, it's interesting. I think actually Naomi touched on some of what I would say is for my answer with this in terms of the practice that she's implementing. A lot of labour market data at universities traditionally has been used in planning teams, market insights teams, those people who are writing up the business case for a programme approval case, and they have got quite proficient at understanding and using the data. And what I've started to see, and certainly I'm very actively encouraging, and it's really paid off because it's making my life very, very busy now with lots of talks to to deans and faculties and all sorts of different departments that maybe we weren't talking to previously, but trying to get that data out of the silos and being shared. People who are proficient in data, who do get it within an institution, who are familiar with it, thinking about which of their colleagues may also benefit from that report they've created, not just to file it away, but also to, hey, send that to the careers team or the employability team if they're not the same people. Send it across the academics in the school who run that program. They might find it useful, and there could be other ways that value can be drawn from that. And I think the more people, a lot of the feedback we get is, oh, we didn't realize that this data even existed, let alone how we might use it and interpret it and work it into frameworks. So I think this is already happening, as Naomi has showcased herself, but we're seeing that right across the sector, all different sorts of profiles of universities going down this route of getting that data out there into different teams and using it in different ways. So I think that raising a profile of labour market data is certainly happening. I think the other thing that we're going to see more generally is perhaps in hiring, and it's something that we're seeing in the US, and it's something that is beginning to happen here. So there's a good chance this trend will transfer across the pond, and that is very much this theme of skills-based hiring. It's less important what your degree title is. We can be degree title agnostic in the labour market, but employers are not skills agnostic. It matters what skills you have and how you're able to articulate the skills that you have as academics and as a sector about within your degree programs and the other offers that you may have, but also how your students are then able to articulate that to employers when they're applying for jobs. And that's going to be really important because they're going to be up against a workforce who may be out of work right now, looking for new work, who have experience because of what's happening in the economy, because of people being laid off. There's going to be a lot more experience competition in the labour market for new graduates. And so being able to talk about your skill set in a way that is relevant to employers, I think is going to be really, really important. And so being able to track that and capture it and know what you've learned and be able to promote yourself on that basis, I think is going to be important in the career space going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and really interesting from the kind of skills perspective, because, as you mentioned there, it's something we talk a lot about within sort of university career services, but there's often a lot of emphasis on that kind of degree agnostic side. But as you say, maybe you've got to be careful with that messaging, certainly around skills. Naomi, just for kind of a final word on this, particularly thinking with your kind of AGCAS hat on, have you kind of seen sort of similar things ahead in regards to the graduate outcome survey and the use of data? And are there any other kind of maybe bold predictions you'd like to make in terms of what might change moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the graduate outcome survey, it's still very much working out what's going to happen with that. I mean, we still don't have any indication of what the performance indicators are going to be. So we're still very much playing a waiting game with graduate outcomes to see how that's going to play out. From a university data perspective, we're obviously already using that first data set within universities, but the granularity of the data means that we're needing to think about it in a slightly different way to how we might have utilized the destination of leavers data previously, so the DELI we were talking about before. I think, kind of echoing Richard's point, what we are seeing is very much that trend towards skills tracking. So thinking about how do we ensure that students have a view of the skills that they're developing in all the different aspects of their student experience. So whether that's their degree course or their extracurricular activity, how is that tracked and recorded? And I hope that we'll see more of a sort of move towards getting a better view of the whole student, as universities, and being able to give students that experience of that sort of single customer view that we see in industry and in particular in industries like hospitality and retail, where they can see the entirety of that experience. For us as institutions to be able to support students most effectively and to help them along that journey and to allow them to develop that level of self-awareness, being able to have that view of the different touch points across the institution is really important. And I think we're going that way, but we're not quite there yet in terms of sort of linking up systems and processes and breaking down some of those silos in terms of where that data sits in institutions. Just as Richard was saying, are we sharing as effectively as we could? Are we seeing the right data sets from every different part of the institution? I would hope to see more of that happening in the future to allow for a better student experience and to allow students to capitalize on their student experience a lot more as well. So that's the sort of thing I think moving forward, it would be really good to see, in particular as we go towards much more interdisciplinary subjects and students kind of crossing over into different sort of subject areas as well.
I think really interesting insights from you both, and ties in a little bit to what Richard was saying right at the beginning of the podcast, actually, in terms of, although there might be some sort of confidence issues around people using this, there are some amazing opportunities in here to think about what we could do with the data that's available and some of the new kind of platforms and visualizations that might showcase that data moving forward. So great to hear all of that. What we're going to be doing is, if you're listening to the podcast now and you've been interested in anything that you've heard, we'll be sharing kind of links and references that we've made in the episode notes. So do check those out if you want to find out a little bit more about everything that Richard and Naomi have been talking about. All that remains to be said is thank you very much for our guests for attending. And I guess given that the time of year that this is going to go out, we should also say Merry Christmas. So Merry Christmas to Richard.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to Naomi.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to Helen.
Merry Christmas.
And a Merry Christmas from me to everyone listening at home. Have a great day. If you're interested in anything that's been discussed on the podcast, or would like to be involved as a guest or have a topic to share, please get in touch with Helen or I via LinkedIn. Full details can be found in the episode notes on the Simplecast site.